And today we're going to talk about, it's chapter 12, it's late Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages is a period roughly, let's say, between about 1300 and 1450, 1500, leading up to the Renaissance. This period is going to see disruption of the economy, of society, and it's going to see the relative decline of the papacy and therefore of the Catholic Church, which becomes badly divided, and that's going to presage the later Protestant Reformation. So it's a period of some turmoil. It's also a period in which the state, although there's quite a bit of conflict, there's quite a few wars, in which you still have a period, however, of state building, and we're going to see this period is the gradual emergence of a stronger England, and even of a relatively unified, not in the modern sense maybe, but a relatively unified France following the 100 Years' War that occurs 14th century into the 15th century. And you know about Joan of Arc, who helped actually lead to the success of the French. So first, let's go back and talk about the economic problems, the social problems, the problems that emerge roughly about 1315 onwards for much of the century, actually. So what was happening? What kinds of disruptions were happening? Well, perhaps you've heard of the Little Ice Age. Temperatures apparently declined in this period, and the considerable cooling resulted in a shorter growing season. The result was that you had less grain being produced, you had less goods being produced in general. Prices were rising as a result. People were going hungry. No doubt this also had a big impact on the survival of the population. So the demographics were going against Europeans at this point, and this crisis will lead to other crises as well. So the Little Ice Age, and right in that period, roughly 1315 to 1322, there was also an infection of sheep over in England, and you may remember that sheep wool was still one of the great staples of commerce. The English, of course, depended on that very much, so did the French, and so you're going to have a lot of the quarrels that are going to emerge are actually going to emerge over who's going to control the woolen industry. But in any case, they go through a bit of a crisis around about 1318, 1319, and later there's going to be actually wars as it recovers, who's going to control that. So the Little Ice Age, the problems with the sheep, which has a huge impact, of course, on the woolen trade and in general on the textile trade. And it's these kinds of things which are going to, as I said, they're going to mushroom, they're going to develop, and of course, when you know it, one of the great tragedies and one of the great emergence of terrible disease is also going to emerge not too long after this period, and that's in 1350, almost all the way to the end of the century. And I'm talking about the Black Death, and the Black Death is a reference to the bubonic plague, something that we don't have to worry about nowadays, although there have been actually recent outbreaks of that. We know how to deal with it now. We have antibiotics. They did not then. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it was called, breaks out. Really probably the first outbreak would have occurred as early maybe as 1347, 1348. Where does all this come from? Well, the carrier of the plague, which is a kind of bacillus, was the flea. And I hope that you don't know anything about fleas. I've had an unfortunate experience with them, having had dogs in the past. But in any case, they were the carriers of the flea. And they tended to nest in black rats. And it just so happens that in this period, as Europeans became much better at sailing and they could reach further points, it appears that they were able, or they were, unfortunately, that they picked up in their ships, as the ships would come from the Middle East and cross the Mediterranean, what they were picking up was the black rats, and black rats were particularly aggressive, and when they would bring them back, of course, the black rat would get off the ships, and it appears that they first arrived in different parts of Italy. No doubt Venice would have been one of the ports. So as a result, unwittingly, Europeans were carrying back the black rat with the fleas, and of course nobody really knew or understood exactly what was happening. They just understood the results or the consequences, which were really terrible. And so it's this, as I said, this goes on for decades, and the Europeans don't know how to deal with this at all. Black rats, it's very easy for them to get into abodes where people live in their domiciles, and of course carrying the fleas would jump off, and there you have an infestation exactly where people were living. There was no protection. It didn't matter how rich you were, how poor you were. Everybody was affected because simply rats could be rather pervasive. They could be everywhere, and so could the fleas. So this went on. The result, of course, was a disaster for many Europeans, not only because of the demographics, but because of the interruption of trade, the impact on agriculture, and generally speaking, a lot of the economies, particularly Central Europe, Western Europe, where the fleas were. And as I said, people were losing maybe half the population in a lot of areas. So you might say that it was very difficult to maintain agriculture. It was very difficult to maintain just about anything. And this would have a huge effect on states as well, because not only was agriculture sort of the center of the economies then, but at the same time, that's how states that were just growing up were able to collect monies and taxes, taxing trade, for example, as well as the citizens or the people living in these areas in these countries. So it's going to have the Black Plague, which sort of mysteriously dies out again around 1400. Nevertheless, it has an overall impact on the European economy. Now, what happens is prices had gone up dramatically as people had died off even before then, when agriculture was collapsing. So agriculture prices had gone up quite dramatically, and that had presented something of a problem too. Then of course everything's collapsing. So what's happening is who's going to do the farming? Who's going to raise the crops? Who's going to produce the food? But at the same time, people are dying, so you have less demand, even as you have less ability to produce anything. So all of this is going to simply lead to sort of extreme instability throughout the century. States, as I said, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to try to impose taxes in order to make up for this. They still have to maintain the armies that they had before. And of course, the name of the game, as far as maintaining your state, you had to maintain your army, you had to maintain the civil administration of the state as well. So what do you do in a period like this? Well, for one thing, what was happening was that money would be debased, so you'd put less silver into coins or less gold into coins, but that of course would also increase inflation. But the problem is still, who's going to do the farming? Who's going to do that? Well, this puts a premium actually on labor, because there were fewer people, there were fewer producers. So now the landowners, the barons, those who served the kings, they had to put a premium on farmers, on labor. And so they began to offer long-term leaseholds or leases to peasants who had to become fairly skilled now in order to really help feed the populations, particularly as they begin to recover, right? So you begin to have at least a little bit more stability. It's good for the peasant. He gets long-term leaseholds. As money becomes worth less because it's being inflated, etc., that means that the lease that what he has to pay to the landlord, to the baron, is actually going to be less and less. So it's actually not a bad thing if you happen to be a skilled farmer, and of course if you happen to be, that is to see somebody who actually survives this whole period. All right, so this is what's happening with respect to the economy. Now let me just take a quick look at the states. This was a period in which you still have state building going on. England is probably the most stable, and some of the institutions that were built that we've already seen, Parliament, right, the agreement between King John back in 1215 and the lords, or the earls, or the barons of the realm, the Magna Carta, which helps establish the relationships between the king's obligations and the obligations of the aristocracy, also to pay taxes and so on in return for rights, which they do acquire. So England is perhaps more stable than just about any country, but France also is in there. And what you begin to have in France is, gradually the French kings, of course, they go to war against the English. The English have many claims on French territories. It's the result of many different kinds of marriages and counterclaims, etc. And you have a period roughly of about 100 years from the 14th century to the 15th century, and it all culminates finally in the French victory at Orleans in 1429, led by, of all people, Joan of Arc, and you certainly know about her. And she helped the man, he was called Dauphin then, Charles VII, and he would become the king sometime after this glorious victory. In 1453, the 100 Years' War finally comes to a formal end. It's only then that the French do manage to defeat the English and assert themselves, and this begins a sort of a period of French power and centralization of authority and so on. So you have sort of the rise of the states, right? To go back to England for a moment, there was the War of the Roses between two different dynasties, and that comes to finally a conclusion in 1485 when the father of Henry VIII, Henry VII, is victorious, and that establishes the Tudor family as the family which is going to sit on the throne. That'll be the monarchical family of England. So these states are growing. They have increasing authority as the wars finally end, as the dynasties are established or reestablished. Now, one of the things, though, since the state has problems raising funds for some time, where's it going to go? Well, it starts to look at the church. And one of the things the church had always said, don't tax us. You can't tax the priesthood. And that goes all the way back some time. We've seen it already in the 11th century. But if you go to the back up to this period, and if you take a look at Boniface VII, who was the pope between 1294 and 1303, what's happening is a conflict now between the papacy and in particular the French throne. Philip the Fair was the king, and in 1302, and the English were doing the same thing. Philip says, I'm going to start taxing the clergy. I'm going to start taxing the church. I need money anyway. They are exempt from taxation, and this is what he does. Of course, the papacy says you can't do that. We are exempt from this. We are above you. They claim the power that they've had for some time. The result is that Philip the Fair actually goes to where the Pope is and puts him under what we would call house arrest. And that's in 1302. And a year later, the Pope actually dies in captivity, and sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity, a reference back to the Hebrews. But in any case, this begins the period of, I would say, relative decline. It contributes to the relative decline of the papacy and therefore of the church as well. And without going into all of the changes and details, what happens is that Philip the Fair actually induces the successor to Boniface to reestablish the papacy, but not in Rome, but in Avignon, which is a city in southern France, not all that far actually from the Mediterranean. And so he brings the Pope there, which essentially means that he now controls the papacy and sets aside the authority of the Cardinal College and sets aside the authority of the Church. In the course of the century that follows, Rome decides, and the Cardinal College decides, to name its own pope. And lo and behold, there's even going to be a third pope before the century's out. So what you've got is the divided papacy, and if you recall, the power of the papacy had always resided, you might say, in the authority of the Pope, and the authority of the Pope represents the indivisible church. Now you have, and that's by right of apostolic succession, now you have three popes, total division, total anarchy within the church. Well, so what's going to happen? Well, there's a reform movement in the church. There's a number of things that are wrong with the church at this time. It's become quite corrupt. Policies like nepotism, for example, the selling of church offices because they bring a certain amount of income themselves, that practice had become fairly widespread. Indulgences, which is the buying of a sort of, let's just call them tokens, but the buying, what the church said was a surplus of goodness that had been brought about by the saints, and that this surplus could be sold as an indulgence to those who could actually afford it. Well, to some, and Martin Luther would say the same thing later on, to some that sounded like you were actually buying salvation, you were buying redemption for yourself. And of course that was a practice that the church was now doing, because the church, remember, was being challenged to pay taxes itself. So the church tries to fight back on that, and it retains these things. So you've got nepotism. I'm sorry, I mentioned Simon. You've got nepotism also, and nepotism is giving offices to friends, family, that kind of thing. So when you add these things up, nepotism, simony, indulgences, the church has become corrupt, and it's become quite rich also in many other ways. So what's the result of all this? Well, there is a reform movement within the church and outside of it as well. So let's take a look quickly at within. Within, you go to John Wycliffe in England. And John Wycliffe, whose years were 1330 to 1384, has said that the church is corrupt. It is not resolving the corruption problems and has not resolved them. And he begins to question legitimacy. This is a man who's a priest. This is a man inside the church itself. He begins to question the legitimacy and the authority of the Pope, of the church, of the priesthood. And what he argues is that the real church is not the church, the Catholic Church itself. The real church is the community of believers, something exactly the same as what Martin Luther will say later on. The real church is the community of believers. What's the source of religious authority? The source of religious authority is the Bible, not the priesthood, not the papacy, not the formal hierarchy. And of course, where is the authority spelled out? It's spelled out in the Bible. That is the text, and one goes back to that. And what John Wycliffe argues in England, and what Jan Hus argues, more or less the same in what's now Czechoslovakia. He had actually his own church in Prague. It's now Prague. And both have argued that the Bible must be the text what one goes to where religious truth is and where the authority is, because it's divine revelation. And if that's true, then one should know the vernacular language. And since the Bible had not been translated into or out of Latin into English or Czech, this becomes exactly the kind of movement that somebody like John Wycliffe and somebody like Jan Hus actually begins to more or less defend and to promote. So this is the beginning of actually the beginning of the translations, of full translation. It doesn't occur right away, but it is occurring, and that, of course, the big issue also with the Protestant Reformation. So there's an attempt within the church to reform it. What's the reply of the church? Well, complete repression of Wycliffe, and of course, Jan Hus is burned at the stake. I believe that was 1414. That's the end of his life, of course. And that's the end of the reform movement within the church. There is a reform movement outside of the church. It's called the Council movement or the Conciliar movement. And that's because there were so many believers, there were so many people who wanted influence in the church. They want to democratize the church. They think it's corrupt. Think it has too much power. And so you'll have representatives from the monarchies, the courts. You'll have representatives from the intellectuals of the day, and the cities, the universities, and the burghers, and merchants, etc., in the towns, men of some wealth. And there was this concerted movement to reform and to democratize the church. So that's the Conciliar movement. It all comes to a head in 1414 with the Council of Constance. And the Council of Constance calls on the internal reform of the church along the lines that I've already talked about. Do something about nepotism, do something about simony, do something about indulgences, right? And the group convenes, all these different groups from the courts, the cities, etc., convene in the Council of Constance in 1414. They name Martin V the Pope, and what they're saying is that doctrine in the church should now be set by the council, hence the council movement, and that should occur every 10 years. So they name Martin V, they name him the Pope, but he's to be simply a titular pope, not one with effective authority. And what does he do? He immediately, I won't say immediately, but the council goes on, it still meets for a while, but once he has authority, he essentially dissolves the council movement, and when he ends the council movement, when he ends the Council of Constance, essentially what he's doing is he's ending reform. So this is the failure of reform. This is already 1414, 1415, And this is the end of the conciliar movement. So it's the end of any success, you might say, in reforming the church from outside the church. It's already failed to reform itself from inside. What's the next step? The next step is going to be maybe a century later, but there's going to be a lot of fermentation. There's going to be a lot of sort of aggravation, a lot of promotion to do exactly the types of things that have failed. In the end, it comes out to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And we'll be talking about that. Next, we'll talk about the Renaissance. Thank you.